Hey everyone, I've been around for a while, and like a lot of people my age, I enjoy a little retro gaming. So naturally, I built myself an arcade cabinet. This thing can run hundreds of games. Anyone out there remember this game?
Marvel Superheroes!
Okay, I'm terrible at this game, but I always really liked the art in it. The sprites and animations are so clean and well drawn. Look at those great silhouettes and poses and shapes. I chose this particular attack from the Hulk, and I set out to learn from it by animating it myself. Here are my results, and I want to share the process with you. It all begins with some fundamentals. The volumes in this character are pretty complex. As you can imagine, it's very easy to get lost in a drawing like this. And not only do we have to draw it, we have to draw multiple frames of it. So here's some really useful simplification and anatomy tips. Let's say we have two volumes, one in front of the other. If I set out to defining that as a simple shape, and I just did this, that wouldn't be enough because this shape just reads flat. There's no longer any evidence of those volumes that I started with. To fix this, I'll wrap a line around one side continuously, but then the other side gets a compression. This little overlappy bit does a lot of work. Namely, it can turn something that's flat into something with form. To further understand the form, I could draw a center line wrapping over the form, and to even further understand the form, I could imagine the two spheres that are under there, pick a light direction, and shade them accordingly. Everything I just did is driven by those underlying forms. It's a very good exercise, especially for beginners, to imagine two spheres basically, one on top of the other, and draw this three-dimensional bean form that conveys them. And I always love to put in this center line, which I'm doing in green here, as kind of proof that I understand the form that I'm drawing. So in figure drawing, the bean tends to be good at representing the torso and hips. You can lay it in and start building limbs or anything you want on top of it. However, I remember watching some rough animation from Disney's Tarzan. I mean, this is just beautiful work, where literally every frame deals with the complexities of the human form. As a student, I would study from these drawings, and while I could see the bean here, these artists seem to be doing something different, something more applied. I noticed that they were observing two very distinct shapes for the torso. The upper shape bulges out and terminates in this kind of winged profile, like this. The lower shape is much thinner, and it comes out from the upper shape and brings you all the way down to the hips. The midline, which I'm putting in now, is much more descriptive of the human body, in this case describing the abdomen. So these shapes seem to lend dimension and pose and are much closer to the human body than the bean was. So that first shape, of course, was the rib cage, a huge volume in our bodies. The winged part at the bottom was, of course, the sternum, with ribs emanating from either side. Now, the next bone going down the body is the hips, here. That means that this area is devoid of bones, which makes it fleshy and stretchy and animatable. This pose shows how much fun you can have with this form, but also how it structurally works integrating with that ribcage form. The ribcage form is reliable, it's solid. It's made of bones, it can twist, but it can't deform. It's an easy candidate to define. Then from there, I can find some complexities, say adding a little twist leading into the hips. That green midline there really helps me to see the twist, and I find this little assembly so useful in visualizing what the rest of the body is doing. Now, where Tarzan is rubbery, the Hulk is more solid, a little closer to a real human. Let's find the ribcage on both of these references. The actual human ribcage is closer to an egg shape, but of course this is art. I can exaggerate it. In the case of the Hulk there, it's wider. And on the Hulk drawing, you can see how the lower shape, the midsection, is tucked into the ribcage. Now, there's a bit of anatomical caricature there, but it's in favor of clarifying form, which is always useful. Here are 3 keyframes from my animation, and I hope you can see now how I'm using that tool to move this guy. So, here's the reference we are going to now animate. Where do you start? Well, I'm choosing the most important pose, and for me that's the end pose, which is what I'm drawing now. That ribcage torso form, which I'm drawing here in green, is absolutely essential to help me figure out the thrust of this pose. Because that form contains a lot of gestural information, I tend to tie it right into my gesture drawing. Let's work through the rest of the animation process right after a word from this video's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Skillshare. I'm always looking to level up my own skills in different creative disciplines. Skillshare is the #1 online learning community for creatives. With thousands of classes led by industry experts across film, animation, illustration, design, freelance, productivity, and more, Skillshare can help you take your career, passions, hobbies, side hustles to the next level. My favorite part about Skillshare is how neatly organized it is. Classes come complete with descriptions, ratings, discussion forums, and projects and resources, all of which help you get the most out of your learning. I really love this class, Expressions for Animation Efficiency in Adobe After Effects. It's tools I use to make these videos, organized neatly into chapters that I am constantly referencing. Skillshare has recently introduced learning paths. These are curated collections of classes intended to be taken sequentially. Each class here is actually a block of classes. Click on a subject that interests you, and you'll be presented with a whole curriculum, a series of classes dedicated to mastering a particular skill. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so you can join right now and see all they have to offer. Thank you, Skillshare, for sponsoring this video. So here's the level of completion that I usually go for with my first drawing. Now I'm working on another frame, and the first thing I'll do is try and find that same ribcage torso form. And here's what I love about it. Because it's such a simple form, it's very easy to maintain its volume from frame to frame, which is a very common animation mistake that students tend to make. That is, your character's volumes appear inconsistent from frame to frame. Oh, and by the way, I'm just using Photoshop for this. Nothing fancy at all. That's why I'm hiding the interface. I'm not doing any tricks. I'm just creating new frames and drawing on them. So feel free to do this in any animation app of your choice. Okay, so I'm thinking about keyframes here. I started with the final pose. So this pose is going backwards in time to a spot where his arms are on the lower end of the thrust. The reason I chose this pose is that it allows me to figure out the arc of his arms. And I've put that arc in the drawing. It's this line right here. You'll see me trace that arc on every frame that contains the thrust of the arms, so I can keep track of it. An arc is the trajectory that's most common with how real beings move. So tracking your arcs is, in my opinion, among the most important things you need to do for professional looking results. I'm starting a new frame now. We're still going back in time here. This is the anticipation pose. That is the wind up before the thrust. And I'm still thinking in arcs, and watch what I'm doing right here. I'm extending that arc to accommodate this pose. His arms are way further back here. The arc tells me where the hands go. In terms of the animation process, my drawings tend to get rougher as I work. I like to flesh out my first drawing a little more. It puts me at ease to know that I more or less have one drawing figured out. Then from there, I can treat the next few keyframes kind of like block-ins. And that's what you see in this frame here. The gesture is there and the volumes are there. And of course, the pose is there, but there's no detail yet. All right, so I want to tackle his arms thrusting upward. Let's take a side step here. The Hulk moves from a base position to this point here, which we've drawn, and his arm is going to move up, up, up in an arc. This is just me rotating a still arm, by the way, and we reach the top position about here. So what frames are we going to draw to represent that motion? This is an animation principle called spacing. If I wanted to make an uncreative decision, I could just have equal spacing, like this. And that movement looks kind of robotic, nothing special about it. As an alternative to that, why don't we take one of the earlier frames and move it here? That'll make the arm appear to move quicker at first and decelerate at the top of the action. And there it is. A subtle improvement for sure, but I mean, we only changed one frame. How about if we just took a frame away? That looks like this. There's suddenly a noticeable snap to it. Okay, what if we brought back that frame, but instead we put it up here, but we use it as an overshoot and then use the other frames to kind of settle the action? That looks like this, and I think is the option that suits this fast motion the best. Okay, let's see what the original reference does. Here's the next frame. Whoa, who saw that coming? Then it locks into that, which is the overextension we just mentioned, before taking 2 frames, 3 if you count the hair, to settle into the final pose. But this, I mean, what a choice that is. It kind of puts 4 frames into one. 1, 2, 3, 4. And notice how that looks a lot like the spacing chart we just had. So back to my animation here. I'm drawing that overextension frame, starting of course with the ribcage torso form and building the arms right off of it. There's that all-important midline. Don't forget the fundamentals. Skipping ahead here, here's that same frame a little further developed. Notice I'm constantly flipping back and forth between frames. Sometimes it's just the neighboring frames and sometimes it's the whole sequence. And all right, here is that crazy smear frame. That's what these are called, by the way. When you are basically drawing the motion blur, it's called a smear. And my primary focus with this smear is to get that spacing in the right spot, as we discussed. Those abstract smeary shapes can almost be anything at that point. So I ended up with this. This drawing here will actually be the very first frame of all this. Sometimes, of course, you do start at the very first frame. In this case, the meat of the action was later, so I started there. At this point though, the volumes tend to draw themselves because I've drawn them correctly so many times. It actually becomes more difficult to make a drawing mistake at this stage because you have so many nearby poses to reference. This is the first in-between drawing I'm doing in this whole process. It is in between this pose and this pose. As you can see, for an in-between, there's an extra amount of flipping going on. And you're not just placing lines literally in between the 2 keyframes. Remember, you are always moving volumes. That means you could be dealing with shifting perspectives on things, or articulating joints in various ways. Also, never forget those arcs. Notice I've drawn the arc on this in-between. Here's one of those frames at the end of the action where he is settling into the final pose. And this is where you can layer some complexity in your animation. It's a principle called secondary action. So the idea is that his arms and shoulders and hips are slowly settling into the final pose, but the hair is being aggressively affected by inertia and then gravity. So you get complexity by having 2 different timings going on. Fast motion in the hair, slower motion in the body. And then this is a copy and paste of the final frame, which was the first frame I drew in this whole process. But I'll just redraw the hair as an in-between between its up position and its final resting position. It's really amazing how much secondary action adds to the final piece. And it's pretty easy to put in so long as you wait until the end to do it. Flipping through the piece, you can really see how that secondary action plays. There's even another sneaky little secondary action. Notice right here, his mouth is really open, and then it closes just a frame before the hair falls. Boop! And there we go. These are my final tied down drawings. Not a full cleanup job, but enough for me to walk away having really learned something. I don't even really consider myself an animator, but animation is such a great way to drill fundamentals that I recommend anyone interested in drawing try this. With animation, it'll be painfully obvious where you're lacking, but equally thrilling where you succeed. Hulk smash!